Many see progress and environmental protection as competing priorities, where one must always be chosen over the other. At ELOS, we see things differently. We see a partnership, a balance between improving the quality of our lives and preserving the places we call home. Our services make it possible for projects to move forward while also ensuring that they comply with all laws and regulations, that sensitive wetlands are not damaged or destroyed, that endangered species and habitats are protected, and that invaluable cultural resources are preserved for future generations. This is where we live, where we play, where we raise our families. We strive for a brighter future, but remain committed to the lands we love. ELOS, where natural environments and human interests intersect.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Bud Faust. I'm the marketing coordinator here at ELOS Environmental. Today we'll be taking a look at the unique role that architectural history plays in cultural resources and the environmental compliance process. Just a couple of small housekeeping items before we begin. First of all, we are recording the presentation. It will be available either tomorrow or Friday on our YouTube channel. You'll receive an email when it is available. If you want to rewatch it, if there's something you missed, also please feel free to share the presentation with any colleagues or anyone you think would be interesting. The second thing is we will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. We will use the chat function for questions. You can enter your question at any time during the presentation, but we won't be addressing the questions until the end of the presentation. But again, you can enter a question at any time during the presentation. Again, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And with that, I will turn you over to our presenter. Thank you.
All right, guys. My name is Sarah Nauer, and this presentation is called In Plain Sight, Architectural History and the Environmental Compliance Process. So to get us started off, ELOS Environmental was founded in 2006 and is located in downtown Hammond, just adjacent to the Hammond Historic District. Within the last few years, ELOS became a part of the Aventia, along with 4 other environmental-focused firms. ELOS provides services such as wetland delineation, environmental permitting, cultural resource surveys, environmental site assessment, industrial hygiene, geographic information systems, mitigation banking, and a bunch more. So this presentation will specifically cover the architectural historic portion of Section 106 procedure. A previous presentation was done by Christopher Wilson of the Cultural Resource Department, specifically talking about Section 106 procedure and the archaeological side of that. So if you haven't watched that one, go check it out. So I am an architectural historian. I got my degree from the University of Pennsylvania. I am originally from Pennsylvania, so having snow down here in Louisiana last year was amazing. Prior to working at ELOS, I worked doing Section 106, primarily looking at bridge replacements, road widening, cemetery encroachments, new building construction, dam removal, and railroad mitigation for states like Louisiana, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, and Texas. Prior to doing Section 106, I used to do historic tax credits for a Fortune 100 company in New Orleans. And before that, I was coordinating the Hammond Historic District. So I worked on a large range of projects. I also have experience listing resources on the National Register and getting them through the tax credit process. So historic preservation, the historic review process occurs within 2 programs when federal funding is utilized. And these programs are not necessarily mutually exclusive, as both aim to evaluate the effects of a project on a resource. At ELOS, as the architectural historian, I do write-ups for both programs. Historic preservation is housed under the Advisory Council for Historic Preservation, and their role is to ensure that what is happening is being facilitated between SHPO, TIPO, NPS, as well as stakeholders like the Army Corps or FEMA. Section 106 tends to have a more narrow scope that looks specifically at historic preservation and archaeology. NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, has a broader scope and looks at historic preservation in addition to environmental factors. So what do we look at? Pretty much anything above ground. It can sometimes be referred to as above ground archaeology. A part of working with ELOS is trusting us to be aware of all the types of above ground items that fall under Section 106 as historic aged. This can be from as common as the houses, historic districts, commercial buildings that are and items that are already listed on the register, to less common things like bridges, malls, roads, and to more uncommon things like abandoned railroad lines, irrigation canals, shopping malls. Here in Louisiana, we have an intercoastal waterway and logging canals, which are also considered eligible if they meet the 50-year requirement. Active railroads are also considered eligible. Abandoned lines, too, if resurrected, would also be regarded as eligible due to the significant role that they played in transportation and community development. So, what are we looking for to establish an APE, an area of potential effects? This is developed around the project area. Simplified, it is the sensory impacts to sight, sound, smell, and elements of integrity. This differs a bit from archaeology, which is looking specifically at below ground disturbances. The APE is established by the architectural historian, me, if it's not provided by a government entity like FEMA or the Army Corps. The APE is based on the scope and location of the project. This can be slightly subjective and differs slightly for each state, since it ultimately comes down to the SHPO reviewers to have the final say of if we picked the right one or not. So a few project examples to keep in mind as we go through the presentation is, considering like if you had a client that wanted to build a house, if you had someone who was building a bridge or replacing a bridge, or if there was a client who was developing a commercial building that was over 1 story, what kind of APE would you need to take into consideration? Fortunately, at ELOS, we have made it through the trial and error period and can confidently establish an APE, which is typically something like a new house at 1 story, 150 meters. Bridges, culverts, and a road is about 100 meters from the center line. So it's accounting for things that would be theoretically impacted by the project in many capacities. So the results. The goal of the evaluation process is a recommendation. If it's ineligible, there is no recommendation for listing on the National Register, and there's no effects to be taken into consideration. So that part is left out of the report for that specific resource. If a resource is considered eligible, a case is to be made for what criteria that it may be eligible under. And in that case, an effects section must also be constructed to describe the potential effects that the project might have, as we discussed on the previous slide for APE. At ELOS, our focus is to inform the client as well as stakeholders about what is eligible and ineligible and the potential effects that they may have on the resource. As part of the process, we also complete all required aspects of reports, including submitting inventory forms, which are housed by the SHPO in most states. They provide an online database that you can look at and figure out if your building has been surveyed previously or not. So when we talk about what is evaluated, there are 2 points to consider for the National Register. For a property to qualify, it needs to maintain its significance, and it needs to retain integrity. These guidelines can be found specifically for historic preservation in Bulletin 15 of the National Register, how to apply the National Register criteria for evaluation, specifically page number 3. So how is the resource evaluated under significance? A historic building is considered under 4 different criteria, which are also applied to other aspects like of archaeology and cultural landscapes. So A is associated with events that may have significant contribution to a broader pattern of our history. There are over 30 areas of significance under criterion A, including agriculture, community planning, development, education, ethnic heritage, exploration, settlement, maritime history, military, transportation, and that's just a few. Things like railroads, schools, cemeteries, and cultural spaces are typically evaluated under criteria A due to their contributions to broader patterns in our history. B is associated with the lives of people significant in our past. A place like a sugar mill that was operated by a wealthy merchant who also happened to build a railroad line that developed a town nearby would be considered eligible under criterion B if there are no other locations that better represent that person or the group of persons. The last 2 are criterion C and criterion D. Criterion C is looking at distinctive characteristics of a building or structure or building, specifically type, period, method of construction that represents a specific style or type. These are looking at 2 categories of architecture and engineering. All buildings, bridges, structures are evaluated under C because they have a physical presence. This is typically where you find discussions of building style and type. Engineering is typically reserved for things like canals and bridges. Criterion D is the category we use for things that yet to have a yielded information or potentially provide information in prehistory or history. Commonly, this is utilized for sites with underground components like cemeteries. In this section of the report, the recommendation would be to refer back to our archaeologist portion of the report, since they're more adept at discussing below ground significance. So the other side of National Register eligibility is integrity. So integrity can impact significance, but significance cannot necessarily impact integrity. Location is the first, can be disturbed if a resource has been moved or demolished, as it literally removes it from its location. The second is setting, which looks at the character of the physical environment. Setting can be impacted by changes to the internal and external aspects of the property. An addition of non-historic structures to the property, like a shed or carports, or elevating a house would significantly diminish the setting. Materials take into consideration elements combined or deposited during a period and in a particular pattern or configuration to form a historic property. Most commonly, the use of non-historic materials diminishes this aspect of integrity. Design is what we consider when we think of style and type, form, plan, space, and structure and style of a property. Design can be diminished if obvious changes have been made. On a house, if a non-historic addition was made or a historic garage was enclosed, that would significantly impact and diminish the integrity. Workmanship takes into consideration materials and design. They're considered if enough character-defining feature remains to convey a specific plan, builder, group, or person. If a building has a brick facade that was covered over in stucco, that would significantly impact the workmanship due to the change in material and design. Or if a roof type was changed, similar impact. Feeling and association support each other. Feeling looks at the aesthetic or historic sense of a particular period of time, presence of physical features. The feeling of a place takes into consideration aspects of placemaking and placekeeping. If a school is converted into an apartment and the exterior is largely altered, it may not feel like a school anymore. Association is the direct link between an important historic event, a person, or a historic property. With association, the same converted school will lose its association with a given community or with the person who built it. if the community was no longer there, there wouldn't be any association. So other services that are provided under historic preservation that I brought to ELOS would be working with listing items on the National Register, both individually and as a historic district. I've also worked on a multitude of historic tax credit projects ranging from renovations of shotgun houses, commercial buildings, historic schools, and skyscrapers. Buildings listed on the National Register or in a historic district are eligible for the historic tax credit at a 25% federal and 25 to 30% the local level if there's a state program. I have experiences in all these matters that I've discussed and would be happy to talk about any aspect of them. These programs are very specific and a little complicated, and ELOS is always here to consult on them.
Thank you, Sarah. If you have a question, please feel free to type it into the chat box. Somebody did ask during the presentation about how many attendees might be new to the Section 106 process in general. So assuming there are some here that are new to the process in general, Sarah, would it be possible to give kind of just a brief overview of the Section 106 process, how it works, what it's for, what its purpose is?
Sure. So Section 106 is a subsection of the National Historic Preservation Act. And it is triggered, which these were triggered, is initiated when any aspect of federal funding is utilized. So even $1 triggers Section 106. And that requires a review of historic structures and archaeological features that could be disturbed due to a project that is funded by federal funding.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Again, please feel free to enter into the chat box if you do have a question. I'd like to ask a question if I could.
Sure.
If there are issues that are discovered, what types of potential solutions might someone come up with for their project to either eliminate those issues or reduce those issues, or how would they deal with that?
Sure. So that process is called mitigation. And it's a conversation that happens between the SHPO and the client and whatever community stakeholder may be impacted. And it could require the client to completely change the alignment of their project, like if it's a pipeline going through wetlands and they may be asked to completely avoid it. There are slightly less complicated things to do, like it may just be a matter of raising or changing the design of a building in a small capacity, but ultimately that would be a discussion that would be had between the client and SHPO.
Okay. Not seeing any additional questions in the chat box. While we're waiting for a second to see, I'll remind you that the presentation is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. If you want to rewatch, or feel free to share with anyone you think might be interested. This is a monthly series that we host. So to see what our next topic will be and when the next webinar will be, please give us a follow on LinkedIn. All right, let's see, we have a question here. What are some best practices for integrating sustainability into the preservation of historic buildings?
I'm going to reread this question so I can give it a
No, that's fine.
the best practices for integrating sustainability. So best practices, a lot of that could fall under, the ways we think about retaining integrity. So especially in historic tax credits, sustainable practices would be replacing in kind or repairing instead of demolishing a building. So that's a sustainable practice. Other sustainable practices would be if there's a railroad line that's still present and your project happens to be going through it, that would be a great way to, mitigate around it so that you're being conscientious of vehicles that are going over it, any construction that's happening around it. When I think about sustainability, I definitely think about it more from a tax credit perspective, just because there's a lot more moving parts because the building's already existed.
All right, we have another question. Okay, they're coming in. Can you speak to some resources that interested parties can access to obtain information about buildings, structures, and sites, aside from reaching out to their SHPO?
Right. So there's definitely more to talk to than just the SHPO. They do a great job, but there are other places. You can look at NPS, you can look at the Advisory Council. There are lots of how-to guides to understand how to do it. I really recommend always looking at a Section 106 report prior to getting into it to understand what the ins and outs are of what you're required to look at, what you're required to do. Yeah, definitely not just all on SHPO.
All right, we have another question. Can you discuss any exemptions for buildings that are listed in the register but have been declared at risk of collapse or public hazard, and documentation that may be needed for demolition?
So instances that I have dealt with buildings that were kind of like a demolition by neglect is, so from this perspective, from looking at it as Section 106, you're looking at the integrity of it. So already that's a building that has a significant loss of integrity, unless it was significant a lot under criterion A. A strong case can't necessarily be made to say that it retains enough character defining features to have it listed in any capacity. If we're thinking about it from a historic tax credit standpoint or listing it on the National Register, there's a bit more flexibility there just because the intention would be to preserve it in some capacity. So if you were able to make a strong case under criterion A and potentially under criterion C for architecture, you can then make a second case saying that by using historic tax credits, these character defining features have been retained, and therefore that's why these plans can be allowed. If you're looking for something in particular to be slated for demolition, then ideally you would try to prove that it doesn't retain those character defining features and doesn't fall under a criterion.
We have another question regarding sustainability with buildings. Is that the restoration of an existing building? There are huge energy savings with not having to manufacture materials that are already in place.
Yep, that's definitely true.
Is there perhaps an additional question you have regarding that? If so, feel free to type it in to the chat box. Give it a moment here. All right. Oh, okay. Not a question, just a statement. Well, thank you very much for your input.
Yeah, it really does support the kind of the big questions and misconceptions behind adaptive reuse, because a lot of times there's the misinterpretation that it's better to rebuild, but more energy is spent by demolishing a building, taking those resources somewhere else to put in a landfill, and then rebuild a new building.
Okay, let's see. I was also, regarding the previous question, I was also thinking in terms of resources. I was also thinking about old newspaper articles, phone books, local historians, and local historic district commissions that could help a community build a case for the history of a building when under threat for loss due to a Section 6 review. Perhaps that information can inform the mitigation discussion.
You know what, Nicole? That is totally right. Those are all great resources to reach out to, and there's so many. You can go to local libraries and look at collections. You can look at online collections. Even just finding an old photograph is complete gold and conveys so much significance and like ways to talk about integrity. Yeah, those are definitely, it would probably be worthwhile having a second like presentation specifically talking about mitigation efforts and resources that you can look at.
Okay, just give it a moment, see if there are any additional questions. As I was mentioning earlier, we do these webinars on a monthly basis. And so please follow us on LinkedIn. And also, if you have any suggestions for topics that you would like to see covered, issues that you perhaps deal with that you feel could use further explanation or further exploration, please feel free to shoot us a message, and we'd love to get your feedback. I'm not seeing any additional questions. In the chat box at the top is Sarah's email address. Should you think of any questions later, or just something come up in the future and you have a project or something that you need help with or a question about, Sarah, please feel free to reach out. Sarah would be more than happy to help you. Really appreciate all of your questions. Very engaged audience. We hope we found the discussion helpful and informative. Again, you'll receive an email when the replay is available on our YouTube channel. Not seeing any additional questions in the chat box. Let me just check one last time. Nope, no further questions at this point. So at this point in the day, we'll thank you for spending some of your lunchtime with us. We do appreciate it, and we hope to see you again. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for stopping by.